My father pushed my plate away at Thanksgiving dinner, and he said, "You'll be eating our leftovers from now on." Why? I asked while my stepmother, Nancy, smiled and kept serving mashed potatoes to my 3 younger half-siblings. Dad didn't answer, just moved my full plate of turkey and stuffing to the kitchen counter, and put an empty plate in front of me instead. This was Thanksgiving at my grandparents' house with 23 relatives watching, and nobody said anything. The divorce was finalized yesterday. He finally spoke while cutting into his turkey. Your mother lost the house and her alimony because the judge saw proof of her affair. I knew about Mom's boyfriend, but I didn't know it would affect my food situation at Dad's house. What does that have to do with dinner? I was 16 and confused why my parents' drama meant I couldn't eat Thanksgiving dinner with everyone else. Nancy stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with a different plate. This is yesterday's food. We had a pre-Thanksgiving practice dinner last night while you were at your mother's. She set down a plate of cold turkey and dried out stuffing. From now on, you eat what we ate the day before. That way, we know exactly how much food costs to feed our real family. My half-brother Jason, who was 12, laughed and reached for the fresh rolls. Does this mean I get her dessert too? Nancy patted his head like he'd said something clever. Of course, sweetie. She can have whatever pie is left tomorrow. My grandmother started to speak, but Grandpa touched her arm, and she stayed quiet. Dad pulled out his phone and showed me his banking app. Your mother drained our joint savings before the divorce. $43,000 gone. That was for your college. He put the phone away and kept eating his fresh food while mine sat there cold. So you're going to earn that money back, Nancy added while pouring gravy on her kids' plates but not offering me any. How am I supposed to earn $43,000? I still hadn't touched the cold food because this felt like a bad dream. You'll work at Nancy's cousin's restaurant every day after school and all weekend. No pay, just tips. Dad said this like it was reasonable. But I have varsity basketball in classes. I played point guard and scouts were already watching me for scholarships. Not anymore. I already told your coach you're quitting. He said this casual like he hadn't just destroyed my future. Basketball won't pay back what your mother stole. Nancy chimed in while serving fresh green beans to her kids. Besides, my kids need those resources now that money is tight. Her kids went to private school while I went to public, but apparently that wasn't enough of a difference. My Aunt Helen finally spoke up. Richard, this is insane. She's a child. She didn't take your money. Dad turned to his sister with his face red. She chose to live with her mother 50% of the time knowing what kind of person she was. He pointed at me. She probably knew about the affair and said nothing. That was true, but only because Mom threatened to hurt herself if I told anyone. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and alternating weekends at that house while her mother spent my money on another man. Nancy fake comforted him while glaring at me. It's only fair she pays it back. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend asking about tomorrow's practice. I had to text back that I couldn't go anymore. For how long? I finally asked, even though I already knew the answer would be bad. Until you've paid back every penny. With interest. Nancy pulled out a notebook where she'd already done the math. At roughly $200 a week in tips, that's about 4 years. She smiled bigger. You'll be 20 when you're done. Just in time to start your adult life debt-free. Jason laughed again and took my dinner roll from across the table. Can I have her Christmas presents too since she'll be working? Dad nodded while Nancy started listing all the things I wouldn't be participating in anymore. No spring break trips, no prom expenses, no senior activities. Every dollar goes to repayment. She turned to her kids. This means more money for your activities, though. Maybe we can finally get that boat Daddy's been wanting. Grandma stood up shaking. I've heard enough of this nonsense. She walked over to me. Come help me in the kitchen, sweetie. But Dad grabbed my wrist. She stays here and eats what she's given. Unless she wants to live with her cheating mother full-time with no support from me. Mom couldn't afford to keep me full-time and he knew it. Grandpa finally spoke and his voice was quiet but angry. Richard, if you do this to your daughter, I'm changing my will. Dad laughed. Go ahead. I don't need your money. That's when Grandpa smiled, which was weird timing. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times before turning it to face Dad. The color drained from Dad's face as he leaned forward to read whatever document was displayed there. Nancy stretched her neck to see over his shoulder and her smug expression melted into something that looked like panic. Dad's hand shook slightly as he held the phone closer, and his jaw clenched tight while his eyes moved across the screen. Nancy grabbed his arm and whispered something, but he shook his head without looking away from whatever Grandpa was showing him. The dining room had gone completely silent except for the sound of Jason still chewing his dinner roll. Grandpa pulled his phone back and set it face down on the table next to his plate. He cleared his throat and looked around at all 23 relatives who were watching this unfold. I want everyone here to witness what I'm about to say. Grandpa's voice carried across the room in a way that made people sit up straighter. My current will leaves everything to Richard, the family business that's worth over $2 million. This house that's been in our family for 40 years, the investment accounts that I've been building since before Richard was born. He paused and took a sip of water while Dad stared at him with his mouth slightly open. I'm calling my attorney first thing Monday morning to change all of it. Nancy made a small sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. Richard won't inherit a single penny if he goes through with this cruel punishment scheme against his own daughter. Dad found his voice and it came out higher than normal. You can't be serious. This is between me and her. You have no right to interfere with how I parent my child. His face had gone from pale to red and he pushed his chair back from the table. That money was supposed to be mine. You've been promising me that business since I was 25 years old. Grandpa cut him off by holding up one hand. Any father who would punish a child for another adult's crimes doesn't deserve to benefit from family wealth. His voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath it. You're not teaching her responsibility, Richard. You're taking out your anger at your ex-wife on an innocent 16-year-old girl. Grandma reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I've been recording everything said at this table tonight. Every word about the 4-year labor scheme. Every detail about forcing her to quit basketball. Every cruel thing Nancy said about feeding her yesterday's cold food. She held up the phone, so everyone could see the recording app was still running. Our attorney will receive this recording along with written statements from everyone who witnessed this abuse. Nancy's panic turned into desperate backpedaling as she stood up from her chair. We were just trying to teach her responsibility. We didn't actually mean 4 years. That was just to make a point about consequences. Her voice had lost all its earlier confidence and she looked around the table for support, but found none. Richard was upset about the money situation, and we thought some structure and discipline would help her understand the value of hard work. Helen's voice rang out sharp and clear from across the table. Don't lie to save yourself, Nancy. You had a written notebook with detailed calculations. She pointed at the spiral notebook that was still sitting on the table next to Nancy's plate. You did the math for exactly 4 years of unpaid labor. You calculated $200 a week in tips and figured out when she'd be 20 and debt-free. Helen stood up and walked over to grab the notebook before Nancy could reach it. And you specifically mentioned getting a boat with the money she'd be earning. Those were your exact words. I couldn't sit there anymore listening to them argue about my future like I was a piece of property they could trade or punish. My chair scraped loud against the hardwood floor as I pushed back from the table. Nobody tried to stop me this time as I walked through the kitchen and out the back door to the porch. The cold November air hit my face and I finally let myself cry for real instead of holding it in. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out to see another text from Hope. Her message said her parents wanted to talk to Mom and me tomorrow morning, and that I should save all the texts Dad had sent about quitting basketball. I hadn't even thought about saving evidence, but Hope was right. I went into my messages and started taking screenshots of everything Dad had sent me over the past 2 days. The back door opened and Grandma came outside wrapping her cardigan tighter against the cold. She sat down next to me on the porch steps without saying anything at first. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner, sweetie. I should have stopped this the moment your father moved your plate away. Her voice cracked and I could tell she was crying too. I was so shocked by what was happening that I froze. That's no excuse though. I should have protected you immediately. She put her arm around my shoulders and I leaned into her. Your grandpa and I are going to make sure you're safe. You'll keep playing basketball and nobody is going to force you into unpaid labor. We promise you that. Through the back door, I could hear raised voices from inside. Dad was yelling something about being disrespected in his own family, and Nancy's voice joined in at a higher pitch. Grandpa's voice cut through both of them asking why Dad had humiliated me in front of 23 relatives, if this was just an empty threat. If you didn't mean it, Richard, then why did you actually contact her coach? Why did you move her food and give her cold leftovers? Why did Nancy have calculations written down? There was a pause and then Dad's voice again, but quieter, and I couldn't make out the words. That's what I thought, Grandpa said loud enough for me to hear. You meant every word until you realized there would be consequences for you. The back door opened again and Helen stepped out onto the porch. Pack whatever you need for tonight. You're staying at my house instead of going back to your father's. She held up her phone. I already texted your mom and she's driving to my place right now. We need to talk about emergency custody modification. My stomach flipped because I didn't know if Mom could afford to take me full-time, but anything was better than going back to Dad and Nancy's house. Helen must have seen my face because she added, Don't worry about the legal stuff right now. Let's just get you somewhere safe and we'll figure out the rest tomorrow. We went around the side of the house to avoid the chaos inside and left through the back gate. Helen's car was parked on the street and I threw my backpack in the back seat before climbing in front. As soon as we pulled away from the curb, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time all night. Helen drove in silence for a few minutes before she started talking. I've been worried about Nancy's influence on your dad for years. He used to be such a good father when you were little. She glanced over at me and then back at the road. After he married Nancy, everything changed. She turned him bitter and mean toward anything connected to your mom. It's like she needed him to hate your mother so she could feel secure in the marriage. The drive to Helen's house took 15 minutes, and we spent most of it with me staring out the window trying to process everything. When we pulled into her driveway, I saw headlights behind us, and Mom's car pulled in right after. She got out looking scared, but there was something determined in her face too. We all went inside, and Helen made tea while Mom and I sat at the kitchen table. I can't afford full custody right now, Mom admitted, and her voice shook. But I've been saving money. Working extra shifts at the hospital and picking up weekend overtime whenever I can. She pulled out her phone and showed me her banking app. I have almost $3,000 saved. It's not enough for a lawyer and a bigger apartment, but I've been building it up for exactly this kind of emergency. More headlights appeared in the driveway and Helen looked out the window. That's Hope's parents. She must have told them what happened. The doorbell rang and Helen let in a tall man in a sweater and a woman with kind eyes who I recognized from basketball games. The man held out his hand to Mom. I'm Jeffrey Mitchell. Hope told us everything that happened tonight and we had to come. He was carrying a legal pad and a pen. I'm a family law attorney and I want to help. What your ex-husband proposed tonight constitutes child labor violations and financial exploitation of a minor. He sat down at the table and started taking notes while I told him everything from the beginning. I recounted everything from the cold turkey plate, to Nancy's notebook with the 4-year calculation, to Dad telling my coach I was quitting basketball without asking me first. Jeffrey wrote down every detail while his wife Cindy sat next to Mom on the couch and held her hand. Mom kept apologizing for putting me in this situation and saying she never thought her mistakes would hurt me like this. Jeffrey stopped writing and looked directly at Mom with a serious expression. He explained that her affair affected the divorce money situation, but it didn't make her a bad parent in the eyes of family court. What Dad and Nancy planned tonight was way more concerning to judges than anything Mom did during her marriage. He said courts care about which parent protects the child's well-being and future opportunities, and Dad just threatened both by trying to force unpaid labor and destroy my basketball career over a debt I didn't create. Mom started crying harder and admitted she'd been scared for months that the affair would be used to take me away from her in custody court. Jeffrey pulled out more papers from his briefcase and spread them on Helen's coffee table. He pointed to different sections about child labor laws and said what Dad proposed violated at least 3 state regulations about minors working without proper compensation. The 4-year unpaid scheme would never hold up in any legal setting because you can't make a child responsible for adult financial problems. Nancy's notebook became crucial evidence because she'd written down specific numbers and timelines that proved this wasn't just an angry outburst, but a calculated plan to exploit me financially. Helen brought out her phone and showed Jeffrey the photos she'd taken of Nancy's notebook when Nancy wasn't looking at dinner. Jeffrey smiled for the first time that night and said Helen had good instincts for documentation. He asked me to pull up all the texts Dad sent about basketball and the restaurant job. I scrolled through my messages and found 6 texts from Dad over the past week, telling me he'd talked to my coach and arranged my work schedule with Nancy's cousin. One text specifically said I wouldn't need my basketball shoes anymore because my new uniform would be a restaurant apron. Jeffrey took photos of every text message with his phone. Cindy asked if I had the work schedule Nancy created, and I remembered she'd texted it to me yesterday. I found that message and it showed every single day after school blocked out for restaurant shifts plus all day Saturday and Sunday with only Monday nights off. Jeffrey calculated the hours and said this schedule would have me working over 60 hours per week, which was illegal for a minor even with proper pay. We spent almost 2 hours going through everything while Jeffrey filled up pages in his legal pad. Helen described what she witnessed at Thanksgiving dinner, including how Jason laughed when Nancy served me cold food, and how Dad grabbed my wrist when Grandma tried to take me to the kitchen. Mom showed Jeffrey her bank statements proving she'd been saving money from working 2 jobs at the hospital. Jeffrey said not to worry about legal fees because he was taking this case for free. He explained that what Dad and Nancy tried to do tonight made him angry both as a lawyer and as a father of 2 kids. Cindy added that Hope had been talking about me all basketball season, and they knew how important the sport was for my college future. Jeffrey said he'd file an emergency custody change motion first thing Monday morning, asking the court to give Mom primary custody immediately. The motion would include all the evidence we'd gathered tonight plus statements from Helen and Grandma about what they witnessed. He explained that emergency motions get heard faster than regular custody cases, because they involve immediate harm to the child. By the time Jeffrey and Cindy left around 11 p.m., I felt exhausted, but also hopeful for the first time since Dad pushed my plate away at dinner. Helen showed me to her guest room and gave me some of her daughter's old pajamas to wear since I didn't have any of my stuff from Dad's house. I climbed into bed and finally felt safe enough to let everything hit me all at once. The humiliation of sitting at that table with cold food while everyone else ate hot turkey. Jason's laughter when he asked if he could have my Christmas presents too. Nancy's fake sweet voice while she calculated 4 years of my life away. Dad's complete betrayal when he said I had to earn back money Mom stole like it was somehow my fault she had an affair. But I also thought about the people who stood up for me tonight. Grandpa threatening to change his will. Helen taking me away from that house. Mom driving over immediately even though she was scared about custody court. Hope telling her parents everything and them dropping everything to come help me. Jeffrey offering to fight for me without charging money. I fell asleep feeling grateful that some people actually cared whether I was treated fairly or not. Saturday morning, I woke up to my phone ringing with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Coach Mitchell's voice came through sounding really angry, and I thought he was mad at me for quitting. But then he said Hope told him what really happened, and he wanted me to know he never processed my withdrawal from the team. He explained that when Dad called him yesterday claiming I needed to quit for family reasons, it felt wrong that a parent would make that decision without the student being present. Coach Mitchell said he'd seen too many talented athletes lose their futures because of family drama, and he wasn't going to let that happen to me. He'd already contacted the athletic director and the school principal about my situation. They wanted to meet with me and Mom on Monday morning to discuss protective measures that would keep Dad from making decisions about my education or sports without Mom's permission. I started crying because I thought my basketball career was over and suddenly it wasn't. Coach Mitchell told me to rest this weekend and be ready for practice Monday after school because the team needed their starting point guard. He said scouts from 3 colleges were coming to watch our next game and I better not miss it. After I hung up, I went downstairs and found Mom and Helen sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee and looking at papers. Mom had brought over all her financial documents and they were trying to figure out if she could afford a bigger apartment that would fit both of us full-time. Helen had a calculator and was adding up numbers while Mom looked worried. I sat down and told them about Coach Mitchell's call. Mom started crying again, but this time they were happy tears. She said she'd been so focused on the legal problems that she forgot I might lose basketball too, and she was. So glad my coach was protecting me. Helen showed me the numbers they'd been working on. Mom had been working 2 jobs since the divorce and had saved almost $8,000 by picking up extra shifts at the hospital whenever possible. It wasn't enough for a lawyer and a bigger apartment in a good school district, but Jeffrey already said not to worry about legal fees. Mom explained she'd been building this savings for exactly this kind of emergency, because she always worried Dad might do something to hurt me as revenge for the affair. We spent Saturday afternoon looking at apartment listings online and making plans for how we'd set up a new place together. Sunday morning, Helen's house phone rang early and she answered it in the kitchen. She called upstairs for me saying Grandpa wanted to talk. I went down and took the phone feeling nervous because I didn't know if he was mad about me leaving Thanksgiving dinner early. But Grandpa's voice was gentle when he started talking. He apologized for not acting sooner at dinner when Dad and Nancy were humiliating me in front of everyone. He said he was shocked into silence at first, but he should have protected me immediately instead of waiting until things got worse. Then he told me he'd already called his lawyer about changing the will like he threatened, but that wasn't the important part. The important part was he wanted to set up a trust fund for my college education that Dad couldn't touch no matter what happened with custody or money. Grandpa said he was putting $50,000 into an educational trust with Helen as the trustee. The money would cover my college tuition and living expenses and nobody could take it away from me. He said I earned that money by being a good kid who didn't deserve to be punished for adult problems. I couldn't talk for a minute because I was crying too hard. Grandpa told me he loved me and he was proud of the person I was becoming, and he'd make sure I had the future I deserved. After I hung up, Mom hugged me tight and said everything was going to be okay now. We had Jeffrey fighting for custody, Coach Mitchell protecting my basketball future, and Grandpa making sure I could go to college. Helen made us all breakfast, and we sat at her table making plans for Monday, when the real legal fight would start. Sunday morning dragged on while I sat in Helen's guest room staring at my phone and wondering what would happen next. Grandpa called around 11 and Helen brought the phone upstairs to me. His voice sounded tired but firm when he started talking. He said he'd been up most of the night thinking about Thanksgiving dinner and what Dad tried to do to me. He apologized again for not stopping it sooner and said he should have thrown Dad out of the house the moment Nancy brought out that cold plate. Then he told me about the trust fund. $50,000 going into an account that only Helen could access as trustee. The money would pay for my college tuition and living expenses, and nobody could touch it or take it away. Not Dad, not Nancy, not even me until I turned 18 and started applying to schools. Grandpa's voice got quiet when he said I earned that money by being a good kid who didn't deserve to be punished for adult problems. I tried to thank him but started crying instead and had to hand the phone back to Helen. She talked to him for a few more minutes about the legal paperwork and then hung up. Mom came upstairs and hugged me while I cried into her shoulder. She kept saying everything would be okay now and we had people fighting for us. The rest of Sunday felt weird and quiet, like the calm before something big was about to happen. Dad started calling Mom's phone around 2 in the afternoon. She let it go to voicemail the first 3 times, but then Jeffrey told her to keep letting it ring, so Dad would leave messages. We sat at Helen's kitchen table listening to the voicemails on speaker. The first one was Dad yelling about how I was being dramatic and needed to come home immediately. The second one accused Mom of turning me against him and poisoning my mind. The third one changed tone completely. Dad's voice sounded shaky, and he said maybe he overreacted at dinner and we should talk about it. The fourth message was him practically begging Mom to bring me back and promising everything would go back to normal. Jeffrey listened to all of them twice and then smiled. He said Dad contradicting himself was perfect evidence because it showed he couldn't keep his story straight about whether the punishment was real or just a scare tactic. Mom asked if the voicemails would help in court, and Jeffrey said they'd help a lot. Monday morning came too fast. Helen's phone rang while we were eating breakfast, and she answered it looking annoyed. Nancy's voice came through the speaker asking to talk to me. Helen mouthed the words, "Record this," and handed me her phone while Mom pulled out her own phone to record. Nancy sounded fake sweet when she started talking. She said Dad was really upset and they wanted to forget the whole thing happened if I just came home and apologized for causing drama at Thanksgiving. I asked what I should apologize for since I didn't do anything wrong. Nancy's voice got sharper and she said I made a scene by leaving dinner early and upset Grandpa and Grandma. She said if I came back and acted like a normal family member, then I could keep playing basketball and wouldn't have to work at the restaurant. I asked about the 4-year repayment plan, and Nancy laughed nervously. She claimed that was never serious and they were just trying to teach me a lesson about consequences. Then she said something about how the tip money would have helped with monthly payments anyway. I asked what payments, and Nancy paused too long before saying payments for household expenses. But Helen was shaking her head and mouthing the word boat. So I asked if she meant the boat payments, and Nancy got quiet. She said she didn't know what I was talking about and then hung up. Jeffrey listened to the recording 3 times and actually laughed. He said Nancy just handed us a gift by admitting they planned to use my labor to pay for a boat. Mom looked confused, and Jeffrey explained that using a minor's earnings for luxury purchases instead of the child's welfare was textbook exploitation. Helen made copies of the recording on 2 different phones just to be safe. Jeffrey left for the courthouse right after breakfast with a folder full of papers. He said he was filing the emergency custody modification motion, and it included witness statements from Helen and Grandma, the recording of Nancy's call, all of Dad's contradictory voicemails, and documentation of the child labor scheme. Mom drove me to the school and we went straight to the principal's office. Principal Hayes was a tall woman with gray hair who always seemed tired, but she sat up straighter when Mom explained what happened at Thanksgiving. Coach Mitchell came to the office along with the school counselor whose name was also Mitchell, but her first name was Kaylee. She wasn't related to Hope's family, which seemed like a weird coincidence. I told them everything about the cold leftovers, the 4-year work plan, Dad quitting basketball for me, and Nancy's notebook with all the calculations. Principal Hayes kept shaking her head and making notes. Coach Mitchell looked furious and said he knew something was wrong when Dad called to withdraw me from the team. Kaylee asked specific questions about Nancy's treatment of me versus her biological kids and whether I felt safe at Dad's house. I said no and explained about Jason laughing at me and taking my food while Nancy encouraged him. Principal Hayes said they were putting protective measures in place immediately. She opened my student file on her computer and added a note that only Mom could make decisions about my education and athletics. Coach Mitchell said he was adding the same note to my athletic records, and Dad would not be allowed to contact him about me anymore. Kaylee looked uncomfortable and said she needed to tell me something important. She explained she was a mandatory reporter for child welfare, which meant if she heard about possible abuse or neglect, she had to file a report. She said this situation was complicated, but she needed to report the labor exploitation scheme to Child Protective Services. Mom started to protest, but Kaylee said this wasn't to punish anyone. She said having an official CPS record might actually help with the custody case because it created documentation that courts took seriously. I asked if I'd get taken away from both parents, and Kaylee said no. She said CPS investigations for custody disputes usually just meant interviews and home visits to make sure I was safe. Jeffrey called Mom's phone during lunch and said the emergency hearing was scheduled for Wednesday. Mom put him on speaker so I could hear. Jeffrey sounded surprised and said family court hearings usually took weeks to schedule, but the judge recognized the urgency. He said Dad already hired his own attorney, a woman named something Sharp who was already trying to negotiate. Mom asked what that meant, and Jeffrey said Dad's lawyer contacted him with a settlement offer. Dad would keep primary custody but agree to let me continue basketball and forget about the restaurant job. Jeffrey asked what I wanted, and I didn't even have to think about it. I said I didn't feel safe going back to a house where Nancy hated me, and Dad thought I owed him $43,000. Jeffrey said that's what he figured, and he'd reject the settlement offer. Tuesday afternoon, I got called out of math class to go to the counseling office. Kaylee was there with a woman in a dark blue suit who introduced herself as Valerie Rowe from Child Protective Services. Valerie had kind eyes, but her voice was all business when she started asking questions. She had me describe Thanksgiving dinner in detail, including who said what and how many people witnessed it. I told her about Dad moving my full plate away, Nancy bringing out cold leftovers, Jason laughing and taking my food, and the notebook with Nancy's calculations. Valerie wrote everything down and asked about Nancy's treatment of me compared to her biological children. I explained about them going to private school while I went to public school, about Nancy serving them fresh food while giving me yesterday's meals, and about her saying they were her real family. Valerie's pen stopped moving when I said that, and she looked up at me. She asked if Nancy used those exact words, and I said yes. Valerie made a note and underlined it twice. Then she asked how I felt about going back to Dad's house, and I said scared. I told her Dad blamed me for Mom's affair, even though I was just a kid when it happened. I said Nancy wanted to use my tip money for a boat payment, and Dad went along with it. Valerie was professional, but I could tell she was disturbed. She said public humiliation of a child is a form of emotional abuse that courts take seriously. She explained that making me eat cold leftovers in front of 23 family members while serving fresh food to other children showed deliberate degradation. She asked if Dad ever apologized or admitted the punishment was wrong, and I said no. She closed her notebook and told me I did the right thing by telling adults what was happening. She said her investigation would take a few weeks, but her preliminary assessment would be available for Wednesday's hearing. Hope's parents called Mom that evening and suggested I stay with them while the custody situation got sorted out. Mom agreed right away because their house was only 10 minutes from the school, instead of the 30-minute drive from her apartment, and the gym where I practiced was even closer. Hope bounced up and down when her mom told her, already planning which drawer I could use and whether I wanted the blue sheets or the green ones. Cindy showed me to their guest room and said to treat their home like my own, and Jeffrey added that he'd already cleared space in the garage for my basketball stuff. They had dinner ready when we came downstairs, and everyone sat at the same table eating the same food. Nobody got served first or got bigger portions, and when Hope's younger brother complained about having vegetables, Cindy just said everyone eats healthy in this house, and that was the end of it. No yelling, no punishment, no cold leftovers from yesterday. Hope and her brother argued about whose turn it was to pick the movie later, and Jeffrey listened to both sides before suggesting they take turns choosing scenes, and they actually agreed. I sat there watching them talk through a simple disagreement without anyone getting humiliated or threatened, and something in my chest loosened up. This was what normal families did. They disagreed and figured it out without making anyone feel worthless. Wednesday morning arrived, and my stomach felt sick with nerves about seeing Dad in court. Jeffrey drove Mom and me to the courthouse early so we could prepare, and he walked me through what would happen step by step. He said family court judges mostly wanted to hear from kids about where they felt safe and what they wanted, and Judge Martinez had a reputation for taking teenagers seriously. He explained that I'd have to answer questions about Thanksgiving dinner and Dad's punishment plan, but he'd be right there and could object if anything got inappropriate. Mom held my hand in the hallway outside the courtroom, and I could feel her shaking almost as much as I was. Then I saw Dad and Nancy walking toward us with a woman in a dark suit carrying a briefcase, and my whole body went cold. Dad started moving in my direction, but Jeffrey stepped between us fast and said all communication needed to go through attorneys from now on. Dad stopped walking and his face went red, but their attorney put her hand on his arm and pulled him back. Nancy stood behind them, glaring at me like I'd ruined her life on purpose, and seeing that look made me more sure than ever that I couldn't go back to that house. Their attorney tried to talk to Jeffrey about settling before the hearing, but he shook his head and said we were going forward. The courtroom was smaller than I expected from TV shows, and Judge Martinez was already sitting at her desk when we walked in. The hearing lasted 2 hours, and I had to sit in the witness chair and describe Thanksgiving dinner all over again, while Dad and Nancy sat across the room watching me. Judge Martinez asked me to explain exactly what happened, so I told her about Dad moving my plate away, and Nancy bringing out yesterday's cold food while serving fresh meals to her kids. I described Jason laughing and taking my dinner roll and Nancy's notebook with the 4-year payment plan calculated down to the week. The judge listened without interrupting, and then asked specific questions about the notebook, whether Dad had apologized and whether I felt safe returning to his house. I said no to the apology and no to feeling safe, and I watched Dad's attorney write something down fast. Judge Martinez asked if anyone had tried to make me change my story or pressure me to drop the custody case, and I said no, but Nancy had called trying to get me to come back if I apologized for causing drama. The judge made a note and asked if I'd recorded that call, and when I said yes, she told Jeffrey to submit it as evidence. Dad's attorney stood up and argued that Dad was just upset about the divorce settlement and didn't actually mean the threats seriously. She said parents sometimes say things in anger that they regret later, and this was just a case of poor judgment during a stressful time. But Judge Martinez interrupted her and pointed out that Dad had contacted my basketball coach to actually quit on my behalf, which showed he was taking real steps to implement the punishment instead of just venting. She asked the attorney to explain how calling my coach fit with the claim that Dad didn't mean it seriously, and the attorney stumbled through an answer about Dad needing time to cool down. Judge Martinez didn't look convinced and asked Dad's attorney to move on to her next point. Then Grandma and Aunt Helen got called to testify about what they saw at Thanksgiving dinner, and Grandma started crying while describing how Nancy served me cold leftovers while her own kids got fresh food. She talked about Jason mocking me and Nancy encouraging it instead of correcting him, and how nobody at that table should have stayed quiet while a child got treated that way. Aunt Helen testified about the notebook and Nancy's comment about using my tip money for a boat payment, and she said the whole thing felt planned and calculated rather than an emotional reaction to the divorce. Judge Martinez called Dad to the witness stand and asked him directly whether he believed I was responsible for repaying the $43,000 Mom took from their joint account. Dad hesitated and looked at his attorney, and she nodded slightly like she was telling him to answer. He said he thought I should contribute to paying it back since I'd benefited from that money over the years through food and shelter and clothes. Judge Martinez's expression changed right then, and she asked Dad to clarify whether he was saying a 16-year-old child owed him money for providing basic parental necessities. Dad tried to backtrack and said that wasn't exactly what he meant, but the judge cut him off and said his answer was clear enough. She asked if he understood that parents have a legal obligation to feed and house their children regardless of divorce settlements or financial disputes, and Dad said yes, but this situation was different. Judge Martinez asked how it was different, and Dad couldn't come up with an answer that made sense. The judge announced a 30-minute recess to review all the evidence and testimony, and Jeffrey said that was actually a good sign because it meant she was seriously considering changing custody instead of just sending me back to Dad with a warning. We sat in the hallway while Dad and Nancy whispered urgently with their attorney on the opposite side, and I watched Nancy's face get more and more angry as their lawyer talked. Mom kept squeezing my hand and Jeffrey reviewed his notes, and I tried not to throw up from nerves. 30 minutes felt like 3 hours, but finally the bailiff called us back into the courtroom. Judge Martinez had a stack of papers in front of her, and her expression was serious when she started talking. She said she'd reviewed all the testimony and evidence, including the CPS preliminary report, and she had serious concerns about Dad's understanding of parental responsibility and appropriate discipline. She said that humiliating a child in front of extended family, implementing a 4-year forced labor scheme, and making a teenager responsible for adult financial problems showed a fundamental misunderstanding of child welfare. Then she ruled that primary custody was immediately transferred to Mom, with Dad getting supervised visitation every other Saturday until he completed a co-parenting class and family therapy. Dad's face went completely white and Nancy made a noise like she'd been hit, but Judge Martinez kept talking. She said Dad's behavior at Thanksgiving dinner and his testimony today demonstrated that he needed professional help understanding appropriate parenting before he could have unsupervised time with me. She added that the court would review the custody arrangement in 6 months after Dad completed his required classes and therapy, but until then, all visits would be supervised by a court-appointed monitor. Judge Martinez picked up her gavel and pointed it at Dad like she was about to make the most important announcement of her career. She said my basketball wasn't optional anymore, that I would keep playing varsity and nobody could take me off the team without my written permission. Dad's attorney tried to object, but the judge shut her down fast by saying the order was already made, and there was no room for discussion. Dad's whole face turned red and his jaw muscles were working like he wanted to argue, but he stayed quiet because even he could tell Judge Martinez wasn't playing around. She added that Dad couldn't contact my school or coach about anything related to me without getting written permission from Mom first, and if he violated that order, there would be serious consequences, including possible contempt charges. Nancy leaned over and whispered something to Dad, but he shook his head and kept staring at the table in front of him. Judge Martinez wasn't done, though, because she started talking about therapy and how Dad needed to complete a bunch of classes before he could even think about getting unsupervised visits with me. She said he had to prove through actual professional help that he understood why making a teenager responsible for adult money problems was harmful and wrong. The judge used words like inappropriate parenting and fundamental misunderstanding of child welfare, and every time she said something like that, Dad seemed to shrink a little bit in his chair. She explained that kids aren't responsible for their parents' relationship failures or financial disputes, and that treating me like I owed him money for basic necessities showed he needed serious help understanding what being a parent actually meant. Nancy tried to stand up and speak, but Judge Martinez cut her off before she even got a full sentence out. The judge said step-parents don't have legal standing in custody matters, and Nancy needed to sit down and be quiet. Then Judge Martinez held up Nancy's notebook, the one with all the calculations about my tips and the 4-year repayment plan, and she said it was one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence she'd seen in a custody case. She called it proof of exploitation rather than discipline, and said that planning to profit from a child's forced labor showed Nancy had no business being involved in parenting decisions about me. Nancy's face went white and then red, and she looked like she wanted to argue, but her attorney grabbed her arm and made her sit back down. The judge finished by saying the custody order was effective immediately, and Dad would get his first supervised visit this coming Saturday at a facility downtown, where a social worker would monitor everything. We walked out of the courtroom, and the hallway felt too bright after sitting in that dark room for 2 hours. Mom grabbed me and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and she was crying, but in a happy way that made her whole body shake. Jeffrey was smiling bigger than I'd ever seen him smile, and he said this was one of the most clear-cut custody modifications he'd ever handled, because Dad's behavior was so obviously harmful that the judge didn't even need to think hard about it. He said most custody cases are complicated with gray areas, but this one was black and white, and Judge Martinez probably would have ruled even harsher if she could have. Mom kept saying thank you to Jeffrey over and over while we walked toward the exit, and he kept telling her it was his pleasure, because cases like this are why he became a family lawyer in the first place. Dad and Nancy came out of the courtroom a few minutes later with their attorney, and Nancy was talking loud and angry about how the judge was biased and didn't understand their side. Dad looked defeated, though, like someone had knocked all the fight out of him, and he didn't even look at us when they walked past to a different exit. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining, and there were people walking around living normal lives, and I realized I could finally breathe properly for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner 3 weeks ago. That afternoon, Mom and I went apartment hunting with money she'd been saving plus $5,000 Grandpa gave her to help with the deposit and first month's rent. We looked at 4 different places, and most of them were either too expensive or in bad neighborhoods or had weird smells, but the last one was perfect even though it was small. It was a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an older building, and the landlord said it had been recently cleaned and painted. The kitchen was tiny with barely enough room for 2 people to stand in it at the same time, but the bedrooms were decent-sized and there was a bathroom that actually had good water pressure. Mom asked about the lease terms, and the landlord said he needed first and last month's rent plus a security deposit, which came out to exactly what Mom had saved plus Grandpa's money. The best part was the location, because it was only 15 minutes from the school, and even closer to the gym where I practiced basketball. We signed the lease right there, and the landlord said we could move in starting next week. Mom cried again in the car afterward and said she'd been so scared she wouldn't be able to afford a place big enough for both of us, but now we had somewhere safe to live together. Hope came over the following Saturday to help me move my stuff out of Dad's house while he was at work. Aunt Helen supervised everything to make sure Nancy didn't start a fight or try to stop us from taking my things. Nancy was there, though, and she kept following us around saying certain items were actually hers or belonged to the house and couldn't be taken. Aunt Helen shut that down fast by pulling out her phone and saying she'd call the police if Nancy didn't back off and let me take my personal belongings. We packed up my clothes, my basketball gear, my laptop and school stuff, and all the personal items from my room, including pictures and decorations. Nancy tried to claim my basketball trophies were family property, but Aunt Helen literally laughed in her face and said those trophies had my name on them, and if Nancy touched them, it would be theft. Hope was amazing through the whole thing because she kept making jokes to keep me from getting too stressed, and she carried boxes down to Aunt Helen's car without complaining, even though some of them were heavy. Jason watched from the hallway looking confused and a little sad, which was the first time I'd seen him show any emotion besides meanness toward me. We got everything loaded in about 2 hours, and I took one last look at my room, which was now completely empty except for the furniture, and I didn't feel sad at all about leaving. My new room at Mom's apartment was way smaller than what I'd had at Dad's house, maybe half the size with less closet space and only 1 window instead of 2. But it was mine, and nobody was going to humiliate me or punish me or make me feel like I didn't belong there. I spent the whole afternoon decorating exactly how I wanted, putting up posters and organizing my stuff in ways that made sense to me instead of following Nancy's rules about how things should look. Hope brought over a housewarming gift of 3 new basketball posters she'd bought at the sports store, including one of my favorite WNBA player. We hung them up over my bed using poster tape, and then just sat on my floor talking about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. She said her parents were proud of me for standing up for myself and getting help, instead of just accepting the punishment Dad tried to force on me. We ordered pizza for dinner and ate it in my room while watching videos on my laptop, and it felt normal and safe in a way that Dad's house hadn't felt in months. The first supervised visit with Dad happened the next Saturday at a facility downtown that specialized in court-ordered family visits. There was a social worker named Mrs. Anderson who sat in the corner of the room with a clipboard taking notes, while Dad and I sat at a table trying to figure out what to say to each other. The room was depressing with gray walls and old furniture that smelled like cleaning products, and there were toys in one corner for younger kids, even though I was way too old for that. Dad tried to apologize, but it felt empty because he spent most of the time talking about how embarrassed he was that the court decision made him look bad in front of the family. He said Grandpa was barely speaking to him, and Aunt Helen had told him he needed to get his priorities straight. I sat there listening and realized he still didn't understand that the problem wasn't how he looked to other people. It was what he'd actually done to me. He kept saying things like he was just trying to teach me responsibility, and he didn't mean for things to go this far. But none of that mattered because he had meant it at the time, and he'd been ready to destroy my future over money Mom took. I finally told him I might be able to forgive him someday, but right now I needed him to actually understand why what he did was wrong, not just be sorry that he got caught and faced consequences. Dad's face got defensive, and he said he was just trying to teach me about consequences for actions, which proved he still completely missed the point. I explained that I didn't take the money, Mom did, and making me pay for her mistakes wasn't teaching consequences, it was just cruelty. He started to argue, but Anderson cleared her throat loud enough that we both looked at her, and Dad seemed to remember where we were, and that everything was documented. The rest of the visit was awkward silence, with Dad asking basic questions about school, and me giving short answers because I didn't know what else to say. When the hour was finally up, I felt relieved to leave, and Mom was waiting in the lobby looking worried until she saw my face and realized I was okay. Monday afternoon, Coach Mitchell called me into his office before practice and said he wanted to officially welcome me back to the team. He'd already told everyone I had a family emergency, but was back now, and he said the team didn't need to know details unless I wanted to share them. I walked into practice, and my teammates were supportive without asking nosy questions, just saying they were glad I was back and asking if I was ready to work hard. We ran drills for an hour, and I pushed myself harder than I had in weeks, feeling my muscles burn and my lungs work, and remembering why I loved this sport so much. Being back on the court doing what I loved instead of working at some restaurant for no pay felt incredible, like I'd gotten a piece of myself back that Dad and Nancy had tried to take away. After practice, Hope and I stayed late shooting free throws, and she said, I looked happier than I had in weeks. And she was right, because for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt like my life was actually mine again. Our next game happened 2 weeks later, and 3 college scouts sat in the stands with clipboards and serious faces watching every play. I knew they were there because Coach told me before warm-up, but I tried not to think about it and just focus on the game like any other Tuesday night. We played against our biggest rival team who had beaten us earlier in the season, and I wanted to prove that loss was a mistake. The first quarter went perfect with me hitting 2 3-pointers and setting up Hope for an easy layup, and by halftime we were up by 8 points. The scouts kept writing notes and talking to each other, which made my stomach tight, but I pushed through and played even harder in the second half. I finished the game with 21 points and 12 assists, which was my best performance all season, and we won by 15 points with the whole crowd on their feet cheering. After the game, Coach pulled me aside in the hallway outside the locker room and told me the scouts were very impressed, especially with how I stayed focused under pressure and made my teammates better players. One scout specifically mentioned my resilience and focus, which Coach said meant they'd been watching me deal with everything at home and saw how I kept performing anyway. He said my scholarship opportunities were better than ever, and I should expect calls from all 3 schools within the week, which made everything I'd been through feel worth it, because my future was still possible. The next Saturday, Aunt Helen called and asked me to come over because she had something important to show me. I rode my bike to her house wondering what was going on, and she was waiting on the front porch with a big folder in her hands. We sat at her kitchen table and she pulled out papers that looked official with lots of legal words and Grandpa's signature at the bottom. She explained that Grandpa had followed through on setting up the trust fund, and $50,000 was sitting there specifically for my college education with her as the trustee, so Dad couldn't touch it. I read through the trust document trying to understand all the legal language, and then I got to the last page where Grandpa had written a personal note saying he was proud of the young woman I was becoming and wanted to make sure I had opportunities he never got. I started crying right there at Aunt Helen's kitchen table because nobody had ever done something that big for me before, and it meant Grandpa believed in me even when my own father didn't. Aunt Helen hugged me and said the money was completely protected from Dad or Nancy or anyone else, and when I was ready for college, it would be there waiting no matter what happened with my family situation. She showed me how the trust worked with quarterly statements and rules about what the money could be used for, which was basically anything education-related, including books and housing and even a laptop if I needed one. The trust document said the money would transfer to me when I turned 18 or started college, whichever came first, and until then, Aunt Helen would manage it to make sure it grew safely. I left her house feeling lighter than I had in months, because my future was secure, and nobody could take that away from me anymore. Mom started going to therapy the following week to deal with her guilt about the affair and how it affected me. She told me about it one night while we were eating dinner at our small apartment, saying she needed to work through her own issues so she could be a better parent. I appreciated her being honest instead of pretending everything was fine, and she apologized for putting me in the middle of her relationship drama and making me keep secrets that weren't mine to keep. We talked for hours that night about everything that happened, and Mom admitted she'd made terrible choices that hurt everyone, including herself. But she was committed to making better decisions going forward. She promised to never put me in that position again where I had to choose between protecting her and doing what was right, and she said our relationship needed to be built on honesty instead of secrets. Over the next few weeks, Mom kept going to therapy every Tuesday evening, and I could see her changing in small ways, like being more open about her feelings and asking me how I felt instead of assuming. Our relationship got stronger because we were finally being honest with each other about the hard stuff, and I started trusting her again in ways I hadn't since before the divorce. She even started talking to Grandma and Grandpa more, working on repairing those relationships that had been damaged by her choices, and they were willing to give her another chance because they saw she was trying. Thanksgiving came around again, and this time was completely different from the nightmare of last year. Aunt Helen hosted at her house and invited Mom, Grandma, Grandpa, Hope's whole family and me for a big dinner with people who actually cared about each other. I walked in and smelled turkey and stuffing cooking, and the table was set with nice dishes and decorations that Aunt Helen had spent all morning arranging. There were no cold leftovers waiting for me, no humiliation, no Nancy calculating how much my food cost, just normal family chaos with people laughing and kids running around. Hope and I helped set the table while her little brother tried to steal rolls before dinner started, and Grandma made her famous green bean casserole that everyone fought over. We all sat down together, and Grandpa said a prayer thanking everyone for being there, and specifically mentioning how grateful he was that our family was healing. The food was hot and fresh, and I ate until I was completely full without anyone counting my portions or making comments about what I deserved. After dinner, we played board games and watched football, and Hope's dad told embarrassing stories about his college days that made everyone laugh. I looked around the room at all these people who had fought for me when it mattered most, and I felt grateful in a way I'd never experienced before, because this was what family was supposed to feel like. Dad finished his co-parenting class in December, according to court reports that Mom showed me. His supervised visitations started getting slightly less awkward because he was learning how to actually listen when I talked, instead of just defending himself or making excuses. During one visit in mid-December, he asked about my basketball season, and actually remembered details I'd told him the week before, which seemed like a small thing, but meant he was paying attention. He started making progress in therapy too, based on what the court monitor told Mom, working through his anger about the divorce and his tendency to blame other people for his problems. The visits were still uncomfortable because we had a lot of history to work through, but I could see him trying in ways he hadn't before the court case. He asked questions about school and my friends without turning everything into a lecture about responsibility or consequences, and sometimes we even had normal conversations about movies or music. I wasn't ready to forgive him completely because the Thanksgiving dinner incident still hurt too much, but I was willing to give him a chance to prove he'd actually changed instead of just saying what the court wanted to hear. Aunt Helen told me in January that Dad and Nancy's marriage was falling apart. She heard through the family network that Nancy was furious about Dad's inheritance being gone and blamed me for ruining their financial plans, especially the boat they'd been planning to buy with money I was supposed to earn. Apparently, Nancy had been counting on that inheritance to fund her kids' private school and family vacations, and now that Grandpa had changed his will, she was stuck with just Dad's regular income. Aunt Helen said there were huge fights at their house about money and priorities, with Nancy accusing Dad of choosing me over her children, and Dad finally starting to see how manipulative she'd been all along. I felt a weird mix of guilt and satisfaction hearing this because I didn't want anyone's marriage to end. But Nancy had been so cruel to me that part of me thought she deserved to lose what she'd been so eager to take from others. By late January, Dad and Nancy officially separated after one final massive fight about finances. Dad moved into a small apartment by himself and actually seemed relieved when he told me during our next visitation. He said he'd been feeling controlled and manipulated for years, but couldn't see it clearly until the court case forced him to examine his choices and priorities. He admitted that Nancy had played on his anger about Mom's affair and convinced him that punishing me was justified, and he was ashamed it took losing his inheritance and almost losing me completely to wake him up. We sat in the visitation room with the monitor in the corner, and Dad looked tired, but more like his old self from before he remarried. He said he was working hard in therapy to understand why he'd let Nancy influence him so much, and he was learning that being a good father meant protecting his child, instead of using her as a target for his own pain. I didn't know if our relationship could ever be fully repaired, but seeing him take actual responsibility instead of making excuses gave me hope that maybe someday we could have something real again. Dad's big therapy breakthrough came in February during one of our visitations. We were sitting in the usual room with the monitor doing paperwork in the corner, and Dad suddenly started crying while trying to apologize. He admitted he was completely wrong to blame me for Mom's choices, and said forcing me to pay back money I didn't take was cruel and unfair in ways he was only now beginning to understand. He gave me a real apology that acknowledged the specific harm he caused, listing out the things he'd done wrong, like taking away my plate at Thanksgiving, trying to make me quit basketball, and planning to force me into unpaid labor for 4 years. He said he'd been so angry at Mom that he'd redirected all that rage at me because I was an easier target, and he was ashamed of himself for being that kind of father. For the first time since everything happened, I actually believed he understood what he'd done, instead of just being sorry he got caught, and I could see in his face that he'd been doing real work in therapy to get to this point. I told him I appreciated the apology, and I could see he was trying, but rebuilding trust would take time, because the damage had been deep and painful. He nodded and said he understood, and he was willing to do whatever it took for however long it took, because being my father was more important than his pride or his anger at Mom. March brought the state championship game and the biggest test of my basketball season. Our team had fought through the playoffs, winning every game by at least 8 points, and now we were facing the top-ranked team in the state for the title. Mom came to watch and sat with Grandma and Aunt Helen on one side of the gym, while Dad came alone and sat on the opposite side because things were still awkward between him and the rest of the family. I could see both my parents in the crowd during warm-ups, and instead of feeling torn between them, I felt grateful they both showed up to support me. The game was intense, with the score tied or within 2 points for most of the first 3 quarters, and I had to dig deep and use everything Coach had taught me about staying focused under pressure. In the 4th quarter, I hit 3 straight shots to put us ahead, then assisted Hope for a layup that sealed the win with 2 minutes left. We won by 12 points, and the whole gym exploded with our fans rushing the court, and my teammates lifted me up because I'd scored 18 points and had 9 assists. They announced me as tournament MVP, and I got to hold the trophy while cameras flashed and everyone cheered, and I looked up in the stands to see Mom crying happy tears and Dad standing and clapping with a proud smile on his face. After the ceremony, Dad came down to the court and told me he was proud and sorry he almost took this away from me, and even though things were still complicated between us, I could tell he genuinely meant it this time. The scholarship offer came 2 weeks after the championship game in a big envelope from my top-choice university. I opened it at Mom's apartment with her standing next to me holding her breath, and inside was a full scholarship package covering tuition, room and board, books, and even a meal plan for all 4 years. The letter said they were impressed with my athletic performance and academic record, and they believed I would be an asset to their basketball program and campus community. Mom started crying and hugging me, and I called Grandpa right away to tell him the news, because without his trust fund, this opportunity might not have been possible. He was thrilled and said the scholarship meant his $50,000 could be saved for graduate school or other opportunities, giving me even more freedom and security for whatever I wanted to do after college. I called Aunt Helen and Hope and Coach, and everyone celebrated like this was their victory too, because in a way it was since they'd all fought to protect my future when Dad tried to take it away. That night, I sat in my small room at Mom's apartment holding the scholarship letter and thinking about how different my life could have been if Grandpa hadn't stood up at that Thanksgiving dinner, if Aunt Helen hadn't taken me in, if Hope's parents hadn't offered legal help, if Coach hadn't refused to let me quit. My future was secure, and nobody could take it from me, and I'd learned that the people who really love you will fight for you when it matters most. April brought a court hearing about Dad's visitation rights, and I sat in the waiting area outside Judge Martinez's courtroom, feeling my stomach twist into knots. Mom squeezed my hand and told me I could say no if I wasn't ready, but I wanted to try because Dad had been working so hard in therapy. Judge Martinez called us into her chambers and reviewed Dad's therapy records with his counselor's notes about progress and breakthroughs. Then she asked me directly if I felt safe spending time alone with him. I told her yes, because even though I was nervous, Dad had been showing up to every supervised visit and actually listening when I talked, instead of just defending himself. The judge approved unsupervised visitation starting with 4 hours every Saturday, and Dad could take me to dinner or activities as long as he brought me back to Mom's by 8. The first unsupervised visit happened 3 days later when Dad picked me up at Mom's apartment and drove us to this Italian restaurant I used to love when I was younger. We sat in a corner booth and Dad ordered my favorite pasta without me having to say anything, which showed he remembered small details about me. He started talking before the food arrived and told me he'd been going to therapy twice a week since January, not just the once a week the court required. His therapist helped him understand how Nancy had used his anger about the divorce to turn him against me and isolate him from his whole family. Dad admitted Nancy had spent months before that Thanksgiving dinner planting ideas in his head about how I was just like Mom, how I probably helped hide the affair, how I didn't respect him or his new family. He said he was so angry about losing the money and feeling betrayed that he let Nancy convince him I deserved punishment, and he couldn't see how crazy and cruel the whole plan was until Grandpa threatened the inheritance. The waiter brought our food, and Dad kept talking between bites, explaining how he'd filed for divorce from Nancy in February after realizing she'd been manipulating him for years. Nancy had isolated him from Grandma and Grandpa by creating drama at every family event, convinced him to cut off Aunt Helen for being too close to Mom, and made him believe his half-siblings needed everything while I deserved nothing. Dad was working on rebuilding his relationships with everyone Nancy had pushed away, and Grandma had started answering his calls again while Grandpa agreed to have coffee with him once a month. Aunt Helen was still cautious, but she'd invited him to her house for dinner next week, which felt like progress. I ate my pasta and listened to Dad apologize for the third or fourth time. But this apology felt different because he was taking responsibility without making excuses or blaming his anger. He acknowledged that even if he was hurt about the divorce, nothing justified humiliating me at Thanksgiving or trying to steal my basketball future. We talked honestly about everything that happened, and Dad cried when I told him how scared I felt that night, how I thought my whole life was ending because he didn't love me anymore. He promised he never stopped loving me, and that Nancy had just convinced him that tough love meant cruelty, which his therapist was helping him understand was completely wrong. By the end of my junior year in early June, I was thriving in ways I couldn't have imagined back at that terrible Thanksgiving dinner. My final report card showed a 3.8 GPA with straight A's in my core classes, and my guidance counselor said my college applications would be extremely strong. The basketball scholarship was officially signed and locked in, which meant I had a guaranteed spot on the university team and 4 years of education completely paid for. Mom and I had settled into a comfortable rhythm at her apartment where we cooked dinner together most nights and talked about everything without secrets or manipulation. Dad's visits had expanded to full weekends twice a month, and we were slowly rebuilding trust through honest conversations, where he proved he'd changed by actually following through on his promises. I could see a future where Dad and I might have a real father-daughter relationship again, not the broken mess Nancy had created, but something healthy and honest. Grandpa's trust fund sat waiting with $50,000 that nobody could touch, giving me security and options I never had before. My teammates voted me team captain for senior year, and Coach Mitchell said scouts from 5 different universities had contacted him about my playing. Hope and I were planning to room together at college since we'd both gotten scholarships to the same school, and her parents treated me like family at every Sunday dinner. Summer started, and I spent the first week of break thinking about how different my life looked compared to 6 months ago. I was heading into senior year with a full scholarship locked in, a trust fund for my future, and a family situation that finally felt stable and loving instead of toxic and scary. The whole nightmare taught me that I deserve to be treated with respect no matter what mistakes my parents made, that speaking up for myself isn't selfish but necessary, and that the right people will always stand up for you when it matters most. Mom proved she could rebuild her life and be the parent I needed. Dad showed that people can change if they do the hard work, and Grandpa demonstrated that family protects family when things get bad. I learned that asking for help isn't weakness, and that sometimes the people you think will save you stay silent while unexpected heroes step forward. Basketball taught me about fighting for what I want, and the custody battle taught me about fighting for who I am. My father pushed my plate away at Thanksgiving dinner and said I'd be eating leftovers from now on, but instead I ended up with a feast of opportunities and people who genuinely loved me. Nancy tried to steal my future to buy a boat, but I got a scholarship and freedom instead. Dad tried to make me pay for Mom's mistakes, but the court made him pay for his own. Sometimes the worst moments create the best transformations, and I walked into senior year knowing I was stronger than I ever thought possible.